Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Mr.
Assalamualaikum.
Junaid will be joining us in 10 minutes, so I guess we'll just start with our session. Until then,
Sure.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Taiba
Assalamualaikum.
Sultana, and I'm a research associate at the Legal Forum for Press Voices of Kashmir. On behalf of our team, especially our director, Mr. Nasir Qadri, who's also with us presently, I would like to welcome you all to the session 5 of our webinar series titled International Armed Conflict and Kashmir. This webinar will cover discussions pertaining to the ongoing military occupation and the international armed conflict from the perspective of international humanitarian law. Mashallah, we have successfully reached the 5th episode of our webinar series, and each of our guest speakers so far have provided us with a very insightful and thought-provoking analysis on the Kashmir conflict. Again, our aim is to keep all the webinars engaging and informative, but also brief by respecting people's valued time. And for that reason, we keep 3 speakers for each session, with 15 minutes of time given to each guest speakers. As you all must be aware that our Twitter handle has been suspended. This was last week, and it's just unfortunate how the Indian authorities cannot even tolerate the legal content that we have been posting. Our tweets, all our tweets are purely legal, and it's just unfortunate to see how the Indian authorities cannot even tolerate that. While whatever content that is there, it's just us speaking on behalf of the Kashmiris and updating on whatever miseries and brutalities that have been going on with the Kashmiris in the Indian administered Kashmir. We have requested the Twitter authorities to revive our account, and we're hoping to have some good news, but let's see what could happen. But again, this is something I guess we were expecting from whoever, the Indian authorities who actually took this step. So yes, hoping for the best, inshallah. That being said, I will now introduce the 3 guest speakers with us today. We have with us Mr. Hassan Aslam Shad. Assalamu alaikum, sir. He's the head of practice of leading Middle Eastern law firm. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, US, with a focus on international law and corporate law. Mr. Shad has written extensively on topics of law, including public and private international law and international relations. Mr. Shad had also had the distinctive honor of being the first person from Pakistan to intern at the office of the president, intern at the office of the president of the International Criminal Court, The Hague. Our second guest speaker will be joining us soon, Dr. Junaid Ahmed, who is a PhD. He's a professor of politics and Islamophobia studies, visiting faculty, University of Leeds, research fellow, Center for Islam and Global Affairs, Istanbul, and the director of the Center for Muslim World Studies and professor of religion and global politics, Islamabad. And our third guest speaker is Advocate Afzal Khoshal, graduate of University of Glasgow in international law. Mr. Khoshal's thesis was on Kashmir conflict with an international law perspective. Mr. Khoshal is also a legal research associate at the LFOVK, currently working with the legal team on policies and legal opinions pertaining to Kashmir conflict. I would like to thank everyone participating in today's webinar, especially our guest speakers who took out time from their busy schedules to align their voices for the oppressed Kashmiris in the Indian occupied Kashmir. Before beginning our today's session, I would like to notify our participants in the webinar that we will be reserving a few minutes for question and answers. After all our speakers are given the chance to provide their expertise, that is. And as the session progresses, if any of our participants who would like to ask questions, we would request them to write them down in the comments here, either in the Zoom meeting or on Facebook live stream. Please write the name of your speaker again, followed by your question, and we'll ask them on your behalf. Thank you. And without further ado, I would like to request Mr. Hassan Aslam Shad to begin sharing his expertise on the matter. The stage is all yours, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today. It's definitely an honor for me to be speaking here because I've been associated with, in my own little way, I have been doing whatever I can to raise my voice on the Kashmir issue. I have written extensively in the past on Kashmir, and we all just need to bear something in mind that it's tiny drops that end up making an ocean. So we should never give up. There are situations when we feel overwhelmed. Like you mentioned, the fact that your account has been suspended. Now that's most unfortunate because there is nothing illegal being published on the account. It's nothing immoral and it causes no harm. It's a free exchange of ideas. You're just sharing your perspective on what should be the treatment meted out to the Kashmiris and what are the steps that India needs to take to unshackle them from a brutal occupation. But I guess we live in an unfair world in which some are more equal than others. So, having said that, let me get down to the discussion. Um, so, look, I mean, the topic I chose for my talk today is the types of armed conflict in international humanitarian law, but that is not what I'm aiming at. The idea behind my talk today is to drive home the point that we should not let these definitions and these legal terminologies convolute our minds and stop us from the end goal, which is the self-determination of the Kashmiris. The fact that we are today caught up in these legal categories, I see a raging debate in the international community amongst Pakistanis, Indians on how to categorize this conflict. Now, of course, I'm not saying that it's not important to categorize a conflict in a certain way. We have a common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which presumably applies to this situation. But the point I'm trying to drive home is that there is an occupation, there are breaches of law occurring. It's not just international humanitarian law, it is international human rights law, it is India's own domestic law, and sadly, none of these things are being recognized by the international community. So there has to be some momentum given to this struggle. There has to be something done differently to make it appear on the global radar for the world to see what's happening and then to take it from there. So last night when I was going through the law, I stumbled upon some articles which had been written by international academia, and I did find that there was this sort of zeroing on the 1990 militant, the 1990s freedom struggle, the attacks that happened in Kashmir, and there was a clear consensus that they constituted a violation of Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. And then that sort of watered down in the future when there was a debate that perhaps Article 3 does not even apply to the conflict today because there is no organization of the freedom fighters. I mean, we call them freedom fighters and we believe they're freedom fighters. The international academia, of course, refer to them as militants. So there was this sort of watering down of the rhetoric that it is no longer Common Article 3 that applies. It's a mere internal matter, or it's a situation that is governed by international human rights law. So I went through those articles, and in the past also I've gone through the pieces that have been written by international academics on Kashmir. And I feel that law is being used to deprive people of their rights. So law has become the vehicle to sort of oppress further, and that is very sad, because the purpose of the law is not to oppress. The purpose of the law is to unshackle, to help the oppressed. And when we look at international the debates that are raging on in relation to Kashmir, we see that there is a conscious effort being made by certain camps, mostly originating from India, to sort of dilute the freedom struggle, to make it appear as an internal struggle that has nothing to do with international law and its violations. So perhaps more than anything, today we need to rewrite the Kashmir narrative. And that is something that I've been talking about in the past. And I've been saying it repeatedly at international forums as well as my interactions with the government of Pakistan that, look, don't treat this as a territorial issue. Stop doing that, because that claim that you have, which is validly grounded in UNSC resolutions, has been sort of corroded by politics. India has used successfully a narrative that Pakistan has sponsored terrorism. Now we know that it has been used by India to its for its own purposes. Perhaps we need to change the prism through which we view Kashmir. Instead of looking at it as a territorial matter, we should look at it as a humanitarian issue. We should look at it from the people's perspective. It is no longer about territory. Well, frankly, when I talk about this, the sort of automated response I get is that the UNSC resolutions only gave the Kashmiris the right to accede to either India or Pakistan. Well, okay, I accept that argument, but at the end of the day, we must never forget that Kashmiris as a people, as a standalone people, have the right of self-determination. Now, that a part of that right of self-determination was captured in the UNSC resolutions, which gave them the right to either join India or Pakistan. But we have to look at it as an inherent issue. If we get into the granularity of the issue, if we get to the bottom of it, we see it as a case of oppression of people's right to self-determination. And therefore, that should be the thrust of any sort of debate on Kashmir, and everything should sort of lead from there. So yes, international humanitarian law is relevant. It will continue to be relevant because it pertains to armed conflict, and there are, continuing to be violations of law being committed by the Indian military, the CRPF or whatever you call them. But that in itself should not and cannot dilute the right that these people have to self-determination. So we need to have, we need to rethink our Kashmir narrative. When I say our narrative, I mean Pakistan, as well as the groups within India, within Kashmir itself. The Kashmiris themselves should also align, should focus on self-determination, which in itself is a standalone right that they are given under international law. So, and another thing that I find very odd in the international community is this sort of, divided view on whether this is Kashmir, India's internal matter or not. Sorry, this is sort of, it's moving away from the focus of today's debate, which is international humanitarian law. But I do feel that these are very important points that we need to consider when it comes to the Kashmir struggle, because we can talk about the law, we can talk about categories, but at the end of the day, law serves a certain purpose, which is to ameliorate the sufferings of the people, to take them out of the black hole of suffering that they find themselves in. So we need to also look at the broader picture, the sort of global narratives that we need to use, and the narratives that have been built against Kashmiris, against Pakistan, that we need to sort of undo. The minds have been poisoned to such an extent that despite the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A on 5th of August 2019, it's still taking us, so much time, so much effort to sort of, sell our case before the world. And and this is where we should focus, and then we should move backwards from there and sort of discuss international humanitarian law, the potential prosecutorial regimes available under the International Criminal Court, the other remedies that we can find ourselves, that we can avail of. So this was just the sort of the broad framework that came to my mind when it came to today's discussion. And I'll pass the floor to you, Tayyaba. I'll let you take over, and then I'll pitch in whenever I feel that I can add some further value once the other honorable participants give their views.
Thank you, Mr. Shah, for sharing your expertise on the matter and highlighting the significance of Kashmiris and their right of self-determination. I will now request our second guest speaker, Dr. Junaid Ahmed, to please share his perspective. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Dr. Junaid, sir, are you there?
I do see him as being
Yes,
there, but I don't see his, yeah.
Okay, guess we'll move on to our third speaker then, and
Yeah.
we'll come back to Dr. Junaid after that. Mr. Afzal, the floor is all yours, sir. You can start.
Thank you, Deva. Uh, Thank you to the speakers here today for their attendance, obviously, and I'm honored to share a platform with such fine gentlemen. And it was fascinating to listen to you, Mr. Aslam Shad, and your views were very, very informative. Um, I'm currently working at the
Thank you,
LFOVK
Mr.
as a
Khan.
research associate, and our team is constantly involved in truth telling, providing legal remedies for the oppressed Kashmiris in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, building policy briefs on the matter, keeping a record of individuals who have been killed or whose human rights have been victimized by the Indian Army on a daily basis. Now, the reason we call the territory adjacent to the line of control of Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir is quite self-explanatory. It is an occupation because of multiple reasons. For instance, if we refer to Article 42 of the 1907 Hague Regulation, which states that a territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. The occupation extends only to the territory where such authority has been established and can be exercised. When it comes to the Kashmir situation currently, the presence of the 900,000 plus Indian military forces in Jammu and the atrocities that are committed there on the population, enforced disappearances, use of torture, arbitrary killings, all of these things are on record, are evidence of the presence of a hostile army, impeding, which serve as an impediment for the exercise of any meaningful usage of any rights or basic human rights. Moreover, the common Article 2 of the four Geneva Conventions of 1949 applied to any territory occupied during international hostilities. They apply in situations where occupation of a state territory meets even with no armed resistance. So the presence of an armed resistance is not crucial to the claim that a territory is under occupation. Rather, the hostilities upon civilian Kashmiris and fighting along the line of control between two high contracting parties, namely Pakistan and India, is what matters and is crucial to the claim. Moreover, once a situation exists which factually amounts to an occupation, the law of occupation automatically starts being applicable. The occupying power need not confess that fact. Therefore, for the applicability of the law of occupation, it makes no difference whether an occupation has received UN Security Council approval, what its aim is, and etc. Um, since it is primarily, the law of occupation is primarily motivated by humanitarian considerations, it is solely the facts on the ground that determines its application. The rules of international humanitarian law relevant to the occupied territories become applicable then. Whenever territory comes under the effective control of the hostile foreign armed forces, even if the occupation meets with no armed resistance and there is no fighting, that is the case. India, according to Pakistan, and in my humble opinion, exercises de facto control, which is evident from the de facto control is basically different from de jure control. The difference is one of fact and the other is of law, meaning an occupier is able to exercise, if it's able to exercise policing and military activities with ease. I mean, the communication blackout of since last year, 5th August 2019, is just the tip of the iceberg of the effective control that the Indian government exercises over Kashmir. The reason why I say that India does not possess de jure control, meaning by law, will be explained in the later half of of my allotted time. For now, the question of control signifies an existence of a situation of occupation, whenever a party to a conflict exercises some level of authority or control within foreign territory. Under the laws of occupation, the duties of occupying power are also spelled out, primarily in the 1907 Hague Regulations, in the articles running from Article 42 to 56, and the four Geneva Convention, Articles 27 to 34 and 47 to 78, as well as certain provisions of Additional Protocol 1 and customary international humanitarian law. The responsibility that it owes to Kashmiri peoples. The occupying power can never acquire sovereignty over the territory. Collective or individual forcible transfers of population from within the occupied territory are prohibited. Transfer of civilian population of the occupying power into the occupied territory, regardless whether forcible or voluntary, are prohibited. The abrogation of Article 370 and then the introduction of the new domicile laws are in violation of these basic responsibilities that Indian forces and the Indian government has and it owes to the Kashmiri people. Collective punishments, which torture has been documented as a method of collective punishment towards Kashmiris, and like Mr. Hassan pointed out, suppressing and diluting the sentiments of self-determination at its core. The other activities which are included are Obviously, the confiscation of property by the occupying power is also prohibited. The destruction of the property is also prohibited. All of these things are the responsibilities of the Indian government, but sadly, these are not followed by the Indian government, and hence they're in violation of these international humanitarian laws and tenets. So, since I pointed out initially that de jure control over Kashmir is India does not possess it, and I say that with due regard to this one crucial hypothesis that I want to embark on right now. The first one relates to the prolonged occupation from 1947 till 2020 today, where India is not sovereign over the territory. This is so because if we give precedence to the UN Security Council Resolution 47, which defines Kashmiri people as peoples eligible for the right of self-determination, Resolution 99 and 122, which condemn the convening of the Constituent Assembly, therefore the addition of Article 370 in the Indian Constitution. Moreover, the instrument of accession is also of little value, considering questionable authority that the Maharaja possessed. He was not sovereign over Kashmir because he was not elected as such by law de jure, considering his unpopularity, and he lost effective control of the territory by a popular rebellion when he fled away from the capital of Srinagar. Moreover, he signed the instrument out of desperation, duress, and an unequal bargaining power with the Indian government. Reference can be made to the Vienna Convention, the law of treaties. It makes the instrument an unequal treaty by that guise, which tarnishes its legal validity. Under the colonial now, I would like to take a step back and explain the right of self-determination, like Mr. Hassan said, pointed out perfectly before, that is the core issue within the Indian occupied Kashmir. It is the exercise of self-determination of the Kashmiri peoples. Before, there is a misconception that self-determination as a right is just means cessation from a territory, and automatically it gives the right to a group of peoples to choose their. However, the main issue is that the right of self-determination has two legal regimes as of now. There is one which I call personally in the colonial context, and the second one is in the post-colonial context, and it is a evolving doctrine right now, which has a link with human rights. As such, it was encapsulated by the common Article 1 of the ICCPR and ICECR. The colonial context definition pertains to resolutions, not only Article 1, 2, and Article 55 of the UN Charter, but the UN General Assembly Resolution 1514 and 1541. 1514 condemns the colonial relationship between people and their governments and affords the right of self-determination to such peoples for the first time ever. One of the provisions relates to the provision of the subjection of peoples into alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation, which makes colonial relationship between people and their governments illegal because it violates fundamental human rights. Because colonial rule was and is injustice, it could not be legalized, not even by plebiscite, just as slavery could not have been legalized through the consent of the slaves. Resolution 1541 then later on described non-self-governing territories. The true prima facie factors to identify them is first, the territory had to be geographically separated and ethically or culturally distinct from the country administering it. Second, once this is established, the colonial condition was then confirmed. If the state administering a territory placed the latter in the position of status of subjugation. Now, this is the case that is happening in the Indian occupied Kashmir. According to the Cabinet Mission Memorandum and the 1947 Independence Act, post the British rule and the partition, the right the people in that sense, in the colonial sense, as a territorial unit, because the right of self-determination in the colonial context is not given to peoples, but to peoples within a territorial unit. That means a territory can exercise its right of cessation unlike the people's choosing their avenues of self-determination and choosing their destiny within a government structure. Now, two things furthermore emerge from this. According to the classic conception, obviously Kashmiri peoples are eligible for the right of self-determination. However, the modern conception of the right of self-determination will assume that India is sovereign over Kashmir. Let's say that, which I highly digress. However, if we assume that the right of self-determination is now applicable in the post-colonial context, since if we go and adhere to the principle of oti possidendi, which the ICJ has used numerous times to solve territorial disputes among countries, the oti possidendi as a rule, as a doctrine, means that once independence has been exercised, once the sovereign entity exercises the right for independence, borders crystallize and solidify. This is to avoid fractional and multiplication of numerous states within a a country emerging from a colony. Now, the modern conception of the right to self-determination finds its footing in the Resolution 2625, which states, states that every country and all peoples deserve the right to self-determination. The principle, the resolution itself was solidified within the ICCPR and ICCR Common Article 1 in spirit and in text, and it was prescribed for all peoples. It creates a link with human rights, and because human rights happen in peacetime, we are assuming, let's suppose, that Indian government is sovereign over its peoples. However, on the reverse engineering of the resolution 2625, we find that there is interplay of dichotomy between internal self-determination and external self-determination. Internal self-determination does not change the territorial boundaries of a state, because it's an exercise within the territorial system of that state. External self-determination, though, has a stage could mean three things. It could mean independence completely from that state, accession to another state, or free association with that state. So the dichotomy then alludes to this, that according to Resolution 2625, if a country does not provide its meaningful exercise of internal self-determination, it loses its sovereignty over those people. So the exercise of self-determination is a mirror image of sovereignty of that country. It signifies the will of those people. So if the peoples are oppressed, and which is the case in the Indian occupied Kashmir, people are oppressed. People are not given. The South Sudan case study exemplifies this. It shows that in the modern context of the right of self-determination, if a country does not provide for the minority rights, it does not allow for meaningful political avenues to attain that internal self-determination, and it does not protect its human rights, then it loses its sovereignty. That's the whole argument for, if we, again, assuming that India is sovereign over Kashmir, which it is not. If the Indian government loses its territorial sovereignty over Kashmir by that guise. Now, this has been alluded by the Canadian Supreme Court in the matter of Quebec as well. They explored the concept of remedial cessation, which according to the ICJ and international law is very neutral on this stance. That remedial cessation is when avenues of internal self-determination are exhausted and are discriminatory, which it is because of the Public Safety Act and how the Indian Army deals with things in the Indian occupied Kashmir upon the civilian population with impunity, orchestrating and perpetrating crimes against humanity and war crimes. The Kashmiri people allegedly are eligible for the right of cessation, remedial cessation rather. the whole crux of this is that no matter how you spin the matter, no matter what hypothesis you pick up, the inalienable right of the right of which is the right of self-determination in the colonial context or the post-colonial context is applicable to the Kashmiri peoples. And since by that, guys, if we consider India sovereign, the last year's 5th August 2019's abrogation in itself, I think, is that final nail in that coffin. And the right of self-determination has attained erga omnes character and jus cogens character, and it becomes a duty upon the international community to facilitate such a right upon the Kashmiri people, protect their basic human rights, and give them justice in accordance with the international criminal law for the atrocities that they have been victimized to. And yeah, this is the whole crux of the right of self-determination, and its intricate interplay with the territorial principle and the right to secede, which is highly discouraged by the international community because of the multiplication of states. However, on both ends, again, I reiterate, the Indian government's presence in the Indian Jammu and Kashmir is an occupation. And by that, guys, they owe responsibilities upon the Kashmiri people, and the right to self-determination does not become redundant in that process. Thank you so much for listening. Teba?
Thank you, Mr. Kushal, on an insightful and thought-provoking analysis on the issue of occupation in Kashmir and explaining how India does not have a de jure control over Jammu and Kashmir, and secondly, the importance of right of self-determination of the Kashmiris, and elaborating the two legal regimes of internal and external self-determination, and also highlighting the right of remedial secession. Thank you very much. And Dr. Ahmed, I would like to request you to please begin sharing your experience on the matter. Thank you, sir. The stage is all yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Teba, and to the other speakers, and my apologies because I was just coming from another lecture, so that's why I was a bit late for here. But I will. I want to applaud the Kashmir Lawyers Forum for having these series in which you have been able to get a variety of the most, I think, incisive legal minds, both within Pakistan and abroad, that are very much concerned with this issue right now, as it is literally imploding since what India has been doing over decades, but particularly over the past 1 to 2 years. So I'll keep my remarks short, and what I wanted to focus on, as I indicated to the organizers, that since we have had a lot of perspectives on the legalities on the issue, and it seems fairly obvious to a decent, honorable, legal mind, international legal mind, that, clearly what India has been doing before and now especially is completely against international law, and it has violated both UN international legal treaties as well as its own specific bilateral treaties with Pakistan. So what I wanted to focus on now, in light of how these legal mechanisms have been insufficient up until now in obtaining even an iota or a modicum of justice for the Kashmiri people. And I want to focus on how the legal angles need to be joined by a whole host of all types of movements and geopolitics, basically the political, how the political needs to be accompanying what we can call the legal, which is of course very important. So there are two parts of that I will go into very briefly. One is the type of international solidarity movement that needs to exist amongst civil society, social movements to express their solidarity with the what's going on in Kashmir. The advantage we have at this point, that in my lifetime at least, we have never seen in particularly the in the Western societies, in the Western mainstream media, political culture, so on and so forth. You have never seen that type of awareness of what is going on in Kashmir. That the type of occupation, the heavily militarized nature of it, all of these things absolutely kind of absent from the Western imagination. Whereas you have had, articles after articles written, usually very pro-Zionist, but at least the issue of Palestine, for example, I'm juxtaposing the issue of Kashmir with what's going on in Palestine, has been going on in Palestine. There has been at least an awareness of what's going on in Palestine. And of course, there again, you see a situation of absolute brutality and occupation and violation of one international legal treaty after the next, and no consequences for the Zionist regime, precisely because of the geopolitics that are involved in that. And that has mainly been because of the uncritical blind support of the United States for what Israel is able to get away with. So I think that what has happened in that can actually offer us lessons on how to kind of build on what we are now seeing the seeds of in terms of international solidarity with Kashmir. Because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the recognition that what Israel is doing in Palestine is so obviously clear that there has had to be an international Zionist campaign for at least since the June 1967 war that has tried to suppress what has been going on, the brutality of the occupation. The only reason that the Zionist forces are so active is because it is so clear of how Israel is radically violating international law and is committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and all sorts of atrocities. So in the case of India, we see now, after many, many decades, that a certain shift in the media coverage has certainly taken place. There are certain factors for this. It's just not happened, because someone whispered to the New York Times or the Washington Post that they have to change their coverage of what's going on. But there are factors in the sense, there are geopolitical factors for that. But there's also an issue with the way the Modi regime internally, within India itself, the BJP and Modi and their semi-fascist to fascist nature, what they have been doing is just too embarrassing in terms of its venality to cover up. And so what has been absolutely, amazing for someone like me who always expects these Western mouthpieces to have a very kind of a Zionist perspective on any issue on the planet. But you have seen over the past 2 years now, and we may just want to give credit to Imran Khan, but I'm not going to do that. But what we have seen over the past 2 years now is one article after the next in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And we must realize, and you can take the British media as well, we must realize that these are not any other newspapers. These are the shapers. These are the opinion makers. These are the organs of what in some ways is being thought about within the national security state itself in the United States and at a broader level in the Western political establishment. So you have seen one article after the next, and very good ones, documenting what is going on in Kashmir. Now, again, like I said, I'll get to a little bit of the geopolitics of what's going on, but first on the level of how the like civil society, social movements have now generated an increased awareness of this issue. That's really important. I think that clearly Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech at the United Nations last year was instrumental in putting this on the world stage, where people may not have even heard of what Kashmir was. But in addition to that, I think that while we certainly applaud that incredible speech, we must realize that there has been an intense escalation of incredible activism by Kashmiri activists and public intellectuals and academics and so on themselves, outside of Kashmir, and to whatever extent within Kashmir as well as Kashmiri journalists. So they, what we have seen over the past more than a year now, is that they have not let the issue go. An issue which was utterly absent from the radar screen before has instantaneously, almost from where what I'm looking at, has come to in the Western imaginary. And so therefore, covering up what is going on when you have the most highly militarized region in the world, in addition to what the BJP and Modi are doing internally, has become very, very difficult. And now, of course, we recently heard of, of the most mainstream human rights. We're not talking about kind of crazy cuckoo lefties or anything like that. We're talking about the most mainstream international human rights organization, Amnesty International, saying we can't even work in India itself. It's become such the barbarism and the state terror of India within itself, as well as within Kashmir, is just, the conditions are just impossible to work within. So these are things that we actually have to take advantage of. Whether it is right now what we have in the international solidarity movement with the Palestinians, that involves various tactics, and one of them is, of course, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which certainly should be on the agenda, even with regards to India at this point. It's certainly, I mean, because even if you would want to argue, well, Kashmir isn't, it's an occupation, and now it's taken over. Internally, not only just in Kashmir, but within India itself, it is apartheid now what's taking place. So, and which brings us back, when using that term, also to the South African example. And a clear international solidarity movement, first led by kind of social movements, civil society, church groups, faith-based groups, etc., saying that we cannot tolerate what's going on in this country, what this country is doing, and specifically in Kashmir, but also internally. And therefore, strategies need to be developed on how to isolate and make India a pariah nation. And since I can go on and on, I will get to the second part of that now, because that is where we have to then see the difficulties involved, and how do we actually do that when there are two cards, really. I mean, to put it very simply, two cards in the hand of the Indian state that it relies on right now to keep itself cushioned and protected from this kind of any type of international disciplinary measure on that state. One, of course, has been there for a long time, since the early 1990s. And this is the important point. I often say this, that for about 30 years, you would never read what you read today in the Western media, including the two main organs of kind of Western influential political culture, that's the New York Times and the Washington Post, about India. For 30 years, you would not read the type of stuff that you're reading now in that press. Whereas for the past 30 years, you would read all sorts of stuff about Pakistan and with regards to Kashmir, the terror, etc., all of that. Okay, so So that has shifted significantly, but that 30-year phenomena was a phenomena of the Indian economy opening up, liberalization, and therefore India just being seen as this huge market to be taken advantage of, and their IT sector and so on. And therefore, don't touch it. We can't touch it on any issue. It's just too big of an economy, too profitable for the international community, other nations and companies to actually say anything about. Okay, that's number one. Number two, which has happened more recently. More recently, I mean, from the late 90s till today, was the gradual and now kind of escalated recruitment of India by the United States and by extension Israel as well as a frontline state in their own belligerence and containment of China. So that has been the other factor, and this is why the geopolitics of this region seem so convoluted at the present point, because India right now is an outlier nation within the regional context. You have closer cooperation and integration going on between a whole variety of nations in the country, including Pakistan. You had the Chinese with the Shanghai, and the Russians with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You had BRICS, which was supposed to again represent an old kind of tradition within India that's totally gone now, of representing a third worldist perspective, a non-aligned perspective. That's completely out the window. Right now, it is basically, I mean, if it believes it's a partner state, it's living in in kind of fantasy world, because actually it has become a vassal state for the U.S. in its approach to China. So the geopolitics of what's going on right now are very, very important. And but the advantage, okay, so those are the two cards that the Indians have. But the interesting thing is that Pakistan has some cards in its hands at this present point as well. And that is that you have probably the two largest superpowers utterly dependent upon Pakistan right now. The United States is dependent upon Pakistan to help it get some respectable withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's continuing to do that. And in fact, the most interesting thing about that, the way the Afghan government has felt marginalized from these direct peace talks taking place between the US and the Taliban. So even the Afghan government that has accused the Pakistanis for every single problem, every attack, every natural disaster, whatever it may be in Afghanistan, has blamed Islamabad for it. Even they have now said that we have to turn to Islamabad in order to at least be a part of this process. So you've had the recent visit by the foreign minister, Dr. Abdullah, and so on. So right now there's that dependence. We know about the Chinese-Pakistani partnership. And that is, again, people often vomit this rhetoric of this kind of a neo-colonial, etc. In fact, this is a situation in which you have two powers which are mutually dependent upon each other. I mean, we have to realize that the centrality of, for example, Gwadar Port for the Chinese in a situation in which the American naval ships, which are completely encircling China, etc., and of course you have then the military bases and so on, if they decide to block trade from China and its access to energy, so on and so forth, that you're talking about 80% of world trade being stopped and so on. So the Pakistani-Chinese relationship is at its strongest point right now as well. So that's another factor. The third factor is that the Indian state, what it has been recruited to do, it's not doing a really great job in it either. I mean, we have seen, we'll get to China in a second, but the embarrassing incident that happened obviously with Pakistan, which of course Imran Khan spoke about in his speech last year. First you have that, then you have these kind of tussles with with China, in which, again, India gets humiliated time and time again. And so it finds itself as this kind of state, internally incredibly barbaric and fascist, and we see the extreme of that in its now. I mean, it's not just a military occupation. We are moving to the basically the old settler colonial model, both in the Israeli model, the U.S. The American model, South African model, the Australian, whatever. We are moving to that type of settler colonial model that the Indians are deploying in Kashmir. The only problem is that there are a whole bunch of factors now that are including even the American national security state, which is increasingly seeing, India as, we heard this mantra about to Pakistan throughout the war on terror. You're not doing enough. You're not doing enough in terms of going after the militants, whether in the Northwest or in Afghanistan and so on. In fact, those of us that know what's going on in the inside of kind of the American intelligence and military bureaucracy, they are in fact kind of having the same now rethinking about India as well. I mean, is it going to be able to play that role against China? Can it facilitate anything? And will it be willing to do so? Will it have its, for example, at some point, will it have military generals that will say that, look, this is suicidal for us? So while right now the conditions in Kashmir seem abysmal, and they are, we have to kind of understand the whole geopolitical context of the situation, in which we can then ask the question, how long can they sustain this? It is almost like a suicidal path that the Indians are on in that region, if they want to undertake these acts, both against this large population of Kashmiris, as well as the internal, close to 200 million Muslims and Dalits and the oppressed classes within India itself. How long will they be able to sustain this without serious, both internal implosions taking place, supported by external social movements, civil society, faith-based groups, and even when those movements put pressures on their states, even by various nation states? It may not, obviously, no one's saying that the United States or the Israelis, who of course are in love with Modi and Hindutva and the Indian state, but there's a lot of other countries that will get on board when you have pressure from below, compelling them to see that how crystal clear it is that what India is doing in Kashmir is precisely the same of all the colonial occupations and forms of oppression still ongoing in Palestine, maybe the Western Sahara and so on. But that long lineage of the kind of an anti-colonial tradition, that international law and countries at that time that claimed to be, the Woodrow Wilson of the United States, the right to self-determination, all of these things. So there can only be a certain amount, a period of time until the international, and I don't like to use this word, the international community, because I think, it's largely meaningless. But what I mean by it is by real civil society, social movements pressuring their states. And many of those, we must remember, both within the South African context and the Israeli apartheid context vis-a-vis the Palestinians, are faith-based groups. And they are speaking out. And we must just follow what's going on and try to link what we're trying to do legally on this front, what the Pakistani state is trying to do politically on this front, and not just Pakistan, others as well. We must try to link that with what these groups, grassroots groups, are doing relentlessly, mobilizing on day after day. So that when Imran Khan spoke at the UN, there was large Kashmir solidarity activism going on right outside the UN building, and that has continued on campus after campus in the West, in the United States, in the UK, etc. This issue is now on the minds of people that had no clue about it before. And that is a huge difference. That's a huge difference and a shift that's taken place. And unlike the Israeli kind of Zionist control over the narrative about what's going on in Palestine for many, many decades, even when people knew about, okay, we've heard of Israel, Palestine, but that narrative was so dominated by the Zionists. In this case, when the issue has actually risen to the fore, where it's being spoken about, we have the opportunity to not let it be dominated by Zionists in the Hindutva forces. And it's not been. I mean, clearly you've seen also the very, very good coverage, unexpected. I will concede that. I did not expect that this would that type of coverage would be given to this issue over the past 2 years. So we have to make these linkages between all of these things. And yes, it does include geopolitics. It does include convincing and putting pressure on other states to mobilize on this issue and to see and to effectively, end with this, to see that, whatever profit, and by the way, the Indian economy is not doing too well these days, but whatever profit the international companies and the states that support them, that they think that they can get from their business ventures in India, should not actually prevent them from seeing the actual brutality and the Indian state terror taking place in Kashmir and internally. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, for providing us with insight on the matter, and it was quite interesting and informative actually to hear your views, and I really appreciate your passion and love for Kashmiris, and I completely agree with you that how important the solidarity movement is, and the need for increasing awareness, and how if 2 years, 3 years from now, the amount of awareness that was before, there's a huge difference now. The people actually who haven't even heard about Kashmir, they are aware of what's going on, and India can no longer hide whatever that they're doing. And it's our duty to keep increasing that awareness and making people aware of whatever is going on. And thank you very much again. Mr. Hassan, would you like to add, would you like to share anything? Please do, sir, if there is anything that you would like to add. Thank you.
No, I would like to share. I would like to thank both the participants for their excellent views. So I'm just going to try and sort of, tie in what Dr. Ahmed and Mr. Khan have mentioned. I do completely agree with Dr. Ahmed that you cannot look at Kashmir solely from a legal prism. There is a wider geopolitical angle to all this. And, at the end of the day, it's always been my belief that, whenever it comes to sort of, self-determination, and this is what has happened in the past. You see that happening in the case of Palestine, and you are also seeing that happen in the case of Kashmir as well. So yes, there's a broader, political angle to this. Pakistan, I do see it going in the Chinese camp more and more with every passing day. The US has been, sort of hedging its bets on India and treating it as a frontline state to contain China, as Dr. Ahmed had mentioned. And this has sort of created this dichotomy between the two countries, and the narratives are being shaped along these lines. So, so at the end of the day, I also see India as sort of cutting its own feet to fit the shoe. India has been on a self-destruction mode. India has been doing certain actions which have actually exposed India and done the job for Pakistan. So, our freedom struggle, or our sort of, efforts on the Kashmir front are as much, a result of our efforts as they are a result of India's own follies and stupid mistakes. So this is helping us. Now, at this point in time, I do feel that, to a great extent, we have, to adopt a sort of a wait and watch approach, because, India is locked with China in a bitter border dispute in Ladakh. India is, has always had a problem with Pakistan. India's economy is not doing well, as Dr. Ahmed mentioned. And these are certain facts that, are here to stay for a while. I don't see them going away. Modi's popularity is not going to go away. India does not seem to have an alternative. So we can expect this status quo to continue for a while. Now, what that means for Kashmir is that India cannot continue to brutally occupy Kashmir forever. I mean, this curfew cannot continue indefinitely. It has to lift one day. And if India continues down the path of destruction that it is on now, we Pakistanis and Kashmiris as a people, through the help of the civil society and, the groups that have been working on the Kashmiri freedom struggle, can actually leverage this at the right time. But what is important is not to let this story, die away. The narrative lines that Pakistan, the Kashmiris have drawn, they should continue. So if we have to wait and watch and see how India ends up destroying itself, until that happens, we should not let this story die down. We should continue to be, more and more sort of, aggressive, if I may use the word, in flashing this story out to the world at large. As Dr. Ahmed mentioned rightly, it's for the first time that you see the Western imagination being, seeing Kashmir. Kashmir is for the first time on the global radar. Nobody knew about Kashmir, and thanks to Prime Minister Imran Khan, of whom I'm a big fan, he flagged this issue. He sold the story at the global stage. Nobody knew what Kashmir was. People had no idea, and it was through his sort of heavy lifting at the UNGA on in that session last year that he set the wheels of the international system in motion. So now the job of Pakistan is to make sure that this continues, it does not die down, and it gains momentum, and hopefully it leads to some positive results down the road. India is India is never going to, accept Pakistan, winning the war of narratives. India is going to try its level best to kill Pakistan's narrative, the Kashmiris' narrative. But the world, we live in a world in which social media is playing a major role. So these stories are now reaching the four corners of the world. And I, frankly, personally, if you ask me, I don't think that the Indian state is as smart as the Israeli Zionists. I mean, a lot of people used to say this to me earlier, that it's possible that India will be able to hijack the Kashmir struggle just like Israel ended up hijacking Palestine. And I say no. Israel had the backing of America, and there are wider geopolitical stakes in that region which are prompting prompting the US to support Israel all out. And there are other, plethora of reasons that prompted US support over the years. Now, we cannot create a parallel between US support for Israel and US support for India. Although it is a fact that the US wants India to contain China, the humiliation that India has suffered recently, its own internal turmoil, the weaknesses, the sort of chinks in its armor that we are seeing today are one day, frankly, going to even make the establishment question whether they are betting on the right horse. Because when you're dealing with a bunch of, fools, you know that the fools can end up, even making your case weak or exposing you to bigger dangers down the road. So I'm pretty sure that the American establishment also is now not having the same soft corner or trust that they had in India of 6 or 7 years ago. It's a changing dynamic. So until such time that India weakens its position further, we should up the ante. We should continue with our sort of making sure that we are keeping the story alive, and this continues and does not die down. So that's the end of my small talk.
Thank you very much again, sir. All our guest speakers shared some really interesting insight on the Kashmir conflict, and I'm sure it provided everyone watching clarity on the current legal and political position of whatever is happening in Kashmir and what would be the possible solutions. Again, I would like to thank our guest speakers and all the participants again. And with this, we shall conclude our session. And I hope all of you have a good day ahead. And Allah Hafiz. Allah Hafiz, all of you.
Allah Hafiz. Thank you.
Allah Hafiz. Thank you.
Allah Hafiz. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.